years after her husband left them for a younger woman. He returned for his kids' money. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. The quiet of the evening was broken only by the soft cooing of baby Emily, nestled in Margaret's arms. The fire flickered weakly in the hearth, mirroring the dwindling hope in Margaret's heart. Across the room, Paul was packing, his movements brisk and indifferent. His suitcases lined the door, a silent proclamation of his decision. "I can't do this anymore, Margaret," he said coldly, his voice devoid of the affection that once drew her to him. "This life, it's suffocating. I need more." Margaret clutched Emily tighter, her knuckles white against the baby's blanket. "More," she echoed, her voice trembling. "More than your daughter. More than your family." Paul didn't meet her eyes. "It's not about Emily. It's about me. I can't be tied down like this. I need freedom." The words cut deeper than she thought possible. Margaret's pleas turned desperate as she followed him to the door. "We're your family, Paul. You don't just walk away from your family." But Paul did. He left with a slam of the door, leaving Margaret standing in the silence, her tears falling silently onto Emily's blanket. In the weeks that followed, Margaret's world crumbled. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter like a cruel monument to Paul's absence. The house, once filled with laughter, was eerily quiet, save for Emily's cries in the middle of the night. Margaret, who had put her career on hold to raise their daughter, was thrust into a reality she wasn't prepared for. She scoured job boards during Emily's naps, applying for anything that could bring in an income. The job market wasn't kind to a woman with a patchy resume and a newborn, but Margaret refused to give up. She began tutoring children in her small town, offering lessons in math and literature. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the lights on and put food on the table. Margaret found strength in her daughter's tiny milestones. Emily's first smile brought a glimmer of hope. Her first steps filled the house with joy again, however fleeting. Margaret poured all her energy into raising Emily, determined to give her the love and stability Paul had refused them. Years passed, and Emily grew into a bright, curious child. She loved to paint, turning the living room into her personal art studio. Margaret, despite her struggles, encouraged Emily's creativity. The little girl's laughter became the music of the house, drowning out the memories of the man who had left them behind. One day, a letter arrived that would change everything. Margaret opened it cautiously, her heart racing as she read the letterhead. "Bailey and Associates, Attorneys at Law. Mrs. Turner," it began. "We are writing to inform you of assets recently discovered within your late father's estate. Upon review, these assets were designated for your daughter, Emily Turner, as the sole beneficiary. Please contact us at your earliest convenience." Margaret stared at the letter, her hands shaking. Her father, a man she hadn't spoken to in years before his passing, had left something for Emily. Didn't make sense. A week later, Margaret sat in the office of Bailey and Associates, her mind buzzing with questions. The lawyer, a kindly man in his 60s, laid out the details of the trust. "It's quite substantial," he explained. "Your father was an astute investor. The trust is intended to cover Emily's education and provide for her future. There are, however, specific conditions. The funds cannot be accessed by anyone other than Emily, and they are protected from outside claims." Margaret's breath caught. Protected from outside claims. She knew what that meant. Paul couldn't touch it. Relief and gratitude washed over her, but also a twinge of dread. She knew it was only a matter of time before Paul found out. Emily blossomed as the years went on. She excelled in school, her artistic talent earning her accolades from teachers and peers. Margaret worked tirelessly to ensure her daughter had everything she needed. The trust remained untouched, a safety net for Emily's dreams. Then, one crisp autumn evening, Margaret's fears became reality. A knock at the door interrupted their quiet dinner. Margaret opened it to find Paul standing on the porch, his once sharp features weathered by time and hardship. "Margaret," he said, his tone almost pleading, "I've been doing some thinking. I made a mistake. Margaret's heart sank. What do you want, Paul? She asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. I want to see Emily, he said. I've missed too much of her life already. I want to make things right. Margaret narrowed her eyes. She didn't believe him, not for a second. But Emily was no longer a baby. She had the right to decide for herself. Come in, Margaret said reluctantly, stepping aside. Paul entered the house, his eyes darting around the living room. It was modest but filled with warmth, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness of the life he had chosen. Emily walked into the room, her expression a mix of shock and confusion. Dad, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Paul's eyes softened as he looked at her. Emily, I'm so sorry for everything. I've made mistakes, but I'm here now. I want to be part of your life. Emily stared at him, her emotions swirling. Margaret watched silently, her instincts screaming that Paul's return was too convenient to be genuine. Over the next few weeks, Paul made a concerted effort to win Emily's trust. He attended her art exhibitions, asked questions about her interests, and even repaired the broken fence in Margaret's backyard. To Emily, he seemed like a man trying to make amends. But Margaret wasn't convinced. One evening, as she flipped through the local newspaper, an article caught her attention. Bankruptcy proceedings filed for Paul Turner. The date of the filing was just weeks before he had shown up on their doorstep. Margaret's suspicions deepened. She began digging, eventually finding a connection that chilled her to the bone. Paul had visited Bailey and Associates months before his return. He knew about the trust fund before he ever knocked on their door. Margaret stared at the evidence, her heart pounding. Paul wasn't back for Emily. He was back for her money. Margaret couldn't sleep that night. The knowledge of Paul's visit to Bailey and Associates gnawed at her. His sudden interest in Emily, the timing of his bankruptcy, it all painted a clear picture. He was after the trust fund, not his daughter's forgiveness. The next morning, she confronted him. Paul, Margaret said, her tone sharper than usual as they stood in the kitchen. We need to talk. Paul glanced up from the mug of coffee he had been nursing. What about? He asked casually, though his expression betrayed a flicker of apprehension. Margaret tossed the newspaper onto the table, the bold headline about his bankruptcy glaring up at him. About this, and about why you really came back. Paul stiffened, his grip tightening on the mug. Margaret, I already told you. Don't lie to me, she snapped, cutting him off. You were at Bailey and Associates. You knew about the trust fund before you came back here. You're not here for Emily. You're here for her money. Paul's face flushed, and he stood abruptly, setting the mug down with a clatter. That's not true, he protested. Yes, I went to the firm, but only to understand what was going on. I'm not after her money, Margaret. Margaret crossed her arms, her glare unwavering. Do you honestly expect me to believe that? After everything you've done? The tension between them was palpable, but before Paul could respond, Emily walked into the room. She froze, her eyes darting between her parents. What's going on? She asked hesitantly. Margaret hesitated, unsure of how much to say. But Paul seized the moment, turning to Emily with an exaggerated look of hurt. Your mother doesn't believe me, he said, his voice trembling just enough to seem sincere. She thinks I only came back for your trust fund. Emily's eyes widened, and she looked at Margaret. Is that true? Margaret felt a pang of guilt but stood her ground. Emily, I've seen the evidence. Your father declared bankruptcy just weeks before he showed up here. He went to the law firm handling your trust. You have to ask yourself why. Paul took a step toward Emily, his expression imploring. Sweetheart, I made mistakes in the past, but I swear I'm here because I want to be part of your life. The money doesn't matter to me. You do. Emily's face was a mix of confusion and pain. I don't know what to believe, she whispered before turning and leaving the room. For days, the tension in the house was unbearable. Paul tried to mend the situation, doting on Emily and making grand gestures to prove his sincerity. He even bought her a set of high-end painting supplies, though Margaret knew he couldn't afford them. Margaret, meanwhile, kept her distance, observing his behavior with a critical eye. She knew better than to trust him, but Emily's growing attachment to her father complicated things. One evening, Margaret caught Paul in the study, rifling through a drawer. "What are you doing?" she demanded, startling him. Paul quickly shoved a folder back into the drawer and turned to face her. "Nothing," he said too quickly. Margaret wasn't fooled. She marched over, yanked open the drawer, and pulled out the folder. It contained copies of Emily's trust documents. "Are you seriously snooping through her finances?" Margaret hissed, her voice low but furious. Paul ran a hand through his hair, his expression a mix of frustration and guilt. "I was just trying to understand how it works," he admitted. Margaret's anger boiled over. "You have no right. This isn't your money, Paul. It's Emily's. And if you can't respect that, then you need to leave." Paul's jaw tightened. "I'm her father," he said defensively. "I have every right to know what's going on with her future." Margaret laughed bitterly. "You gave up that right the day you walked out on us. Don't pretend to care about her future now." Their argument was interrupted by Emily, who stood in the doorway, her face pale. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaky. Margaret hesitated, but Paul spoke first. "Your mother doesn't trust me," he said, his tone dripping with wounded pride. Emily's eyes darted to the folder in Margaret's hands. "What's that?" Margaret sighed, knowing the truth had to come out. "It's your trust documents," she said carefully. "Your father was going through them without permission." Emily's expression darkened as she looked at Paul. "Is that true?" Paul's shoulders slumped. "I was just trying to understand how it works," he repeated weakly. Emily's hands balled into fists at her sides. "You're not here for me, are you?" she demanded. "You're here for the money." "Emily, no," Paul protested. "I came back because I love you. The money doesn't mean anything to me." Emily shook her head, her voice breaking. "Stop lying. Just stop. I let myself believe you cared, but you don't. You never did." Paul reached for her, but she stepped back. "Emily, please," he pleaded. "I made mistakes, but I'm trying to make up for them. Don't shut me out." Emily's voice hardened. "You shut me out years ago. Don't come back now and act like you deserve a second chance." That night, Emily locked herself in her room, refusing to speak to Paul or Margaret. Margaret's heart ached for her daughter but felt a grim satisfaction that Paul's true motives had been exposed. The next morning, Paul packed his bags, his face a mask of defeat. "I'm going to give her space," he told Margaret as he stood by the door. "Do her a favor," Margaret replied coldly. "Make it permanent this time." Paul hesitated as if he wanted to argue but thought better of it. With a heavy sigh, he walked out the door, leaving Margaret and Emily to pick up the pieces once again. Paul's departure brought a tense quiet to the house. Margaret hoped it would be the end of his interference, but Emily remained withdrawn. She spent hours locked in her room, her once vivid art supplies left untouched. Margaret, heartbroken for her daughter, decided to give her space while keeping a close eye on her. Days turned into weeks, and while Paul's physical presence was gone, the shadow of his betrayal lingered. Emily finally emerged one afternoon, her face resolute but weary. "I've made a decision," Emily said, sitting across from Margaret at the kitchen table. Margaret set down her coffee, her heart tightening. "What is it, sweetheart?" Emily hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her mug. "I don't want the trust fund." Margaret blinked, startled. "Emily, that money is yours. It was meant to secure your future. Don't let your father ruin that for you." Emily shook her head. "It's not just about him, Mom. It's about what it represents. That money ties me to people who've hurt me. Grandpa, who barely knew me, and Dad, who only cares about it. I don't want it hanging over me." Margaret reached across the table, taking Emily's hand in hers. "Then what do you want to do?" Emily's gaze grew steady, her voice firm. "I want to use it to help people. People like us. Families who've been abandoned, single moms trying to make it work. I want to turn something painful into something good." That evening, Emily and Margaret met with the lawyers at Bailey and Associates. Margaret explained Emily's wishes, and the lawyer listened carefully, nodding as he scribbled notes. "We can certainly set up a foundation," he said, flipping through his papers. "The funds can be transferred into a charitable trust, and Emily can oversee how they're used. It's a generous and noble choice." Emily glanced at Margaret, seeking her approval. Margaret smiled, her pride shining through. "If this is what you want, I'll support you every step of the way." The foundation took shape quickly, with Emily and Margaret pouring their hearts into its creation. Named the Margaret and Emily Hope Fund, it aimed to provide financial aid, resources, and community support to struggling single-parent families. The announcement of the foundation caused a stir in their small town, but the real shock came when the media picked up the story. Headlines celebrated Emily's decision. "Young artist turns family fortune into beacon of hope," and "Trust fund for good, a daughter's bold move." Paul, who had been keeping a low profile since his departure, saw the news on a television in a dingy motel room. His jaw tightened as he watched Emily on the screen, her poise and determination on full display. "The money wasn't mine to begin with," Emily said during an interview. "It was meant to build a better future, and that's exactly what I plan to do, with or without my father." Paul turned off the television, his mind racing. He felt anger, not at Emily but at himself. He had squandered every opportunity to be part of her life, and now even her success was a testament to his absence. Months later, Margaret received a letter from Paul. It was short and riddled with regret. Margaret, "I know I've failed you both in ways I can't undo. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I needed you to know that I am proud of Emily. She's an incredible young woman, and that's because of you. Thank you for raising her when I couldn't." Paul Margaret read the letter twice before tucking it into a drawer. She didn't tell Emily about it. There was no need. Meanwhile, the foundation flourished. Emily's art gained recognition, and her gallery shows became a key source of funding for the charity. Families across the country wrote letters of gratitude, sharing how the foundation had changed their lives. One day, as Emily sorted through these letters, she came across one that struck her deeply. It was from a young mother named Clara who had been left with 2 children after her husband walked out. "Your story gave me hope when I felt like giving up," the letter read. "Because of the foundation, I've been able to go back to school and build a future for my kids. Thank you for believing in people like me." Emily handed the letter to Margaret, her eyes glistening. "This is what it's all about," she said softly. Margaret hugged her daughter, their bond stronger than ever. "You've turned something painful into something beautiful," she said. "Your father may have left, but he didn't take away our strength." Paul's attempts to reconcile with Emily dwindled over time. He tried reaching out once more, sending a message through the foundation's website, but Emily chose not to respond. "I've said everything I needed to say," she told Margaret. "He made his choices and I've made mine." In the years that followed, the foundation became a national success. Emily's name was synonymous with compassion and resilience, her art celebrated as a reflection of her journey. Margaret, content with the life they had built, watched her daughter thrive with a heart full of pride. As for Paul, he faded into obscurity, a man haunted by the life he could have had if only he had chosen differently. His final attempt to claim the trust fund had only ensured he would never be part of Emily's life again. And for Emily and Margaret, the true inheritance was never the money. It was the strength, love, and determination that had carried them through. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.